On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin summoned his top ministers Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, as was his routine, to watch a cowboy movie, which was Stalin's favorite. He had them stolen from the West, and they had no subtitles. Later, they retired to Stalin's dacha, where they sat down to a meal at 1 a.m. Stalin inquired whether confessions had been extracted for the doctor's trial, which he would soon oversee. That winter, Stalin had been waging a witch hunt against Kremlin physicians, many of whom were Jewish, claiming that they had murdered top Soviet officials in a plot. The trial was to start within weeks. It was at this meal that some historians believe that Stalin may have been poisoned to death. We will go over the facts and come to a conclusion. Khrushchev had taken a nap earlier in the day because he knew what happened to people who dozed at Stalin's table. Khrushchev danced a Ukrainian dance during the dinner. Stalin drank too much of his favorite Georgian red wine before ending the dinner at around 5 or 6 in the morning. According to Khrushchev, we said goodbye to Comrade Stalin and departed. When we were in the entrance hall, Stalin came out as usual to see us off. He was in a jocular mood and joked a lot. He waved his index finger or his fist and prodded me in the stomach, calling me Mikola. He always used the Ukrainian form of my name when he was in good spirits. Well, we left in good spirits too, since nothing had happened during the dinner. Those dinners did not always end on a happy note. The next day, a Sunday, Khrushchev remained at home, expecting Stalin to call to extend a meal invitation for that evening. But Stalin did not call him, or anyone else for that matter. He didn't call for food, nor had the sensors installed in Stalin's rooms detected movement. The servants claimed that they were too afraid to disturb Stalin. Historians Zorez and Roy Medvedev are suspicious of this narrative. It wouldn't have been normal for the staff to be afraid of entering Stalin's room or even to ring him on the house line. Stalin's wrath was so terrible that no one had dared to disturb him when he hadn't emerged from his bedroom by early evening. He was finally discovered in pajama trousers and a vest on the carpet, snoring. His aides thought he was still drunk, but he was probably already in a coma. How did it come to this? Joseph Stalin had been one of the original Bolsheviks, along with Lenin and Trotsky, that took part in the Russian Revolution. As the years passed and Lenin suffered a stroke, Stalin plotted to hasten Lenin's death by pretending to worry about his health. Stalin had insisted that Lenin be kept from his daily duties. After Lenin's death, Stalin slowly seized power and ensured that he was associated with Lenin in propaganda posters. He wanted the people to know that he was the next Lenin. Near the end of World War II, the victorious Allies met at Yalta and Potsdam to hash out what would happen in a post-Nazi world. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin introduced Lavrenti Beria to U.S. President Roosevelt as R. Himmler. Beria was Stalin's influential chief of secret police and the head of the NKVD. In order to stay in power, Stalin knew that he had to have the support of the people. Even to this day, Russians have mixed feelings about him. Was he a great man who got them through the war, or a mass murderer? Knowing that winning the war was not enough, Stalin knew that he had to build up Soviet infrastructure to compete with the West in the long run. He liked to show the Soviet people that he was planning and looking out for their best interest. Stalin had one glaring weakness that most dictators have. He knew that he could be taken out of power and executed. When those under him felt they had enough power, they might strike at him. He knew he was old and he only had a few years left at most. His latest purge was against the Jewish doctors. He claimed that there was a Zionist conspiracy and was ready to put Jewish communists and doctors on trial. This is why he was discussing this trial at his last meal. So, was Stalin poisoned? If so, who would dare risk such a thing, and why? Stalin's comrades in arms at that time included Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's likely successor and deputy premier. Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's influential chief of secret police, who was also jockeying for power. He was very similar in function to Nazi Germany's Himmler. Nikita Khrushchev, whom Stalin had summoned to Moscow to balance the power dynamics between Malenkov and Beria. Nikolai Buganin, Stalin's defense minister. Those closest to him knew that Stalin was in poor health. He was in his 70s and had suffered either a heart attack or a series of strokes in 1945, and his health hadn't been the same since. His paranoia, too, was at an all-time high. With the latest purge of the doctors and communists, those closest to Stalin knew that he may be all smiles right now, but their head could be on the chopping block soon, too. It had already happened many times before to others like them. Cui bono, a Latin phrase that means who benefits. Law enforcement detectives use this principle to ascertain who might have committed a crime, especially murder. In order to find out if Stalin was murdered, we have to look at the facts. There were only a few people who had access to Stalin the night before his collapse. There are the servants, and there are these 4 men at the dinner. We can probably rule out the servants because they had been around Stalin for years and had nothing to gain and possibly much to lose if he were poisoned. So we're down to the 4 men at the dinner table on the night of February 28, 1953. Let's go through each one. Nikita Khrushchev expected Stalin to call him the next day for a repeat of the former night. He would have much to gain, as he became the next Soviet premier, but that wasn't a certain thing at the time. He seems innocent and unknowing about the events that happened later and only seems to react to them. Nikolai Buganin was Stalin's defense minister, but as time would tell, he had no ambition to reach for the highest rung of leadership. Georgy Malenkov was Stalin's likely successor and deputy premier. Everyone knew this. In fact, after Stalin died, Malenkov succeeded him as premier of the Soviet Union for a week, until others stepped in to demote him. Lavrenti Beria was an evil man by any standard. He was a known rapist who hunted down women on the streets of Moscow on a regular basis. He was very ambitious and had an evil character, and many feared him. With his network of spies and contacts, he seemed poised to take over. There are many similarities between Beria and Heinrich Himmler. Beria ran the NKVD, which were the Soviet secret police troops. He had a lot of power and he knew it. However, Beria was this paranoid person just like his boss. He knew that others could try to get rid of him, or he could get rid of them first. Beria also had seen what happened once Stalin started his purges, which is exactly what he was doing now. Many heads would roll, and Beria's might too.
Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so you don't miss out on future content.
After Stalin's death, Beria fatally underestimated his opponents. As Khrushchev, the outsider, would soon show, the struggle for who would fill the power vacuum left in Stalin's absence was just beginning. In 2013, scholars Jonathan Brent and Vladimir Naumov unearthed new details from the final report issued to the Soviet Central Committee about Stalin's death. Here are the facts. The servants said they were fearful to wake or call Stalin, and that in itself was unusual. This means they suspected something was wrong and didn't want to be involved. Stalin drank a lot of Georgian diluted wine at his last dinner. The doctor's visit was deferred for a full 12 hours after Stalin was rendered paralyzed, incontinent, and unable to speak. Stalin had extremely high blood pressure, hardened arteries, and a fatty liver, according to the 11-page autopsy report. It stated that he had succumbed to a stroke which caused him to suffocate. The post-mortem report was held until now under lock and key in the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History. The final autopsy report would never include death by poisoning because of the Stalinist policies in place at that time. The doctors would be signing their own death warrant. On March 5th, Stalin vomited blood and his stomach started hemorrhaging. Poison, perhaps in the form of the poisonous, tasteless blood thinner warfarin, could have easily been slipped into Stalin's drink, and he could have caused his stomach hemorrhaging. At a public event in July 1963, while welcoming a delegation from Hungary, Khrushchev said, "There have been many brutal dictators in human history, but all of them died from an axe, just as they also gained power with an axe." In the transcript of the speech later published in Soviet newspapers, these words were omitted. Beria had, immediately after Stalin's stroke, gone about spewing hatred against Stalin and mocking him. When Stalin showed signs of consciousness, Beria dropped to his knees and kissed his hand. When Stalin fell unconscious again, Beria immediately stood and spat. Others tried to tell Beria that the unconscious Stalin, still in his soiled clothing, was sick and needed medical attention. Beria angrily dismissed the claims as panic-mongering and quickly left, ordering, "Don't bother us, don't cause a panic, and don't disturb Comrade Stalin." In the uneasy silence following the cessation of Stalin's last agonies, Beria was the first to dart forward to kiss his lifeless form. Soon after, Beria's ambitions sprang into full force. While the rest of Stalin's inner circle stood sobbing unashamedly over the body, Beria reportedly appeared radiant, regenerated, and glistening with ill-concealed relish. When Beria left the room, he broke the somber atmosphere by shouting loudly for his driver, his voice echoing with what Stalin's daughter Svetlana called the ring of triumph unconcealed. She noticed how the Politburo seemed openly frightened of Beria and unnerved by his bold display of ambition. "He's off to take power," Mikoyan recalled muttering to Khrushchev. That prompted a frantic dash for their own limousines to intercept him at the Kremlin. After Stalin's death, Beria claimed to have killed him. This aborted a final purge of old Bolsheviks Mikoyan and Molotov, for which Stalin had been laying the groundwork in the year prior to his death. Shortly after Stalin's death, Beria announced triumphantly to the Politburo that he had done Stalin in, and saved us all, according to Molotov's memoirs. The assertion that Stalin was poisoned by Beria has been supported by Edward Radzinsky and other authors. After Stalin's death, Beria was appointed first deputy premier. His close ally Malenkov was the new premier and initially the most powerful man in the post-Stalin leadership. Beria was second most powerful, and given Malenkov's personal weakness, was poised to become the power behind the throne and ultimately leader himself. Khrushchev became party secretary. Stalin's children, Svetlana and Vasily, were called to the dacha on March 2nd. Vasily was drunk and angrily shouted at the doctors, resulting in him being sent home. According to Svetlana, it had been a difficult and terrible death. The little girl presented is not Svetlana, but is possibly a daughter of one of Stalin's men. On March 6th, Stalin's death was announced to the public. The funeral lasted 3 days. You can see Khrushchev and Beria in the funeral procession. Svetlana and Vasily watched their father's funeral. Vasily had started drinking at a young age and eventually died in 1962 from alcohol-related health problems. Svetlana defected to the United States in 1967 and died aged 85 in Wisconsin on November 22, 2011. During the funeral procession, Stalin was led through the streets to be seen by the shocked crowds. All the important men in the post-Stalinist world surrounded Stalin's body.
Он был действительно кусок дерьма.
This is a good lifelike drawing of Stalin in his casket.
Где будет похоронен товарищ Сталин?
Він був справді лайно.
Ой, заткнись, ублюдок тупой.
This is Joseph Stalin's death mask. Stalin's funeral procession outside. Was Stalin murdered? On one hand, Stalin was old and in ill health. It wasn't a surprise that he died. There have been many Soviets and historians who have suspected that Beria poisoned Stalin in order to save his own skin. Beria had the means, the motivation, and the perfect opportunity. Let's not forget that he claimed to have murdered Stalin in order to protect himself and everyone else. The last nail in the coffin is the fact that Stalin's symptoms were consistent with poisoning. We can never be certain, but the weight of the evidence is that Beria did it. Knowing his health was bad and to confuse his succession, Stalin eliminated the Politburo and replaced it with a larger version called the Presidium. September 1952, the Doctors' Purge. Several Kremlin doctors were arrested for allegedly plotting to kill senior politicians. The majority of the accused were Jewish. Stalin instructed the arrested doctors to be tortured to ensure confession. On November 1952, the Slansky trial took place in Czechoslovakia as 13 senior Communist Party figures, 11 of them Jewish, were accused and convicted of being part of a vast Zionist American conspiracy to subvert Eastern Bloc governments. Also, a much publicized trial of accused Jewish industrial wreckers took place in Ukraine. On February 28th, Stalin invited Georgy Malenkov, Lavrenti Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, and Nikolai Bulganin to a cowboy movie and an all-night drinking dinner. According to Khrushchev, Stalin was in a good mood before going to bed. March 1st, 1953, 6:30 p.m. Stalin's staff found him semi-conscious on the bedroom floor of his dacha. After Beria arrived, he noticed that Stalin was snoring and stated that he should be left alone to sleep. He was moved onto a couch and remained there for 3 days. He was hand-fed using a spoon, given various medicines and injections, and leeches were applied to him. March 2nd. Stalin's children, Svetlana and Vasily, were called to the dacha. Vasily was drunk and angrily shouted at the doctors, and he was sent home. March 5th, 1953, 9:50 p.m. Stalin died, triggering a crisis in the Politburo, which ultimately ended with Nikita Khrushchev succeeding Stalin. March 6, 1953, Stalin's death was announced to the public. March 6 through 9, 1953, Stalin's body was embalmed and then placed on display in Moscow's House of Unions for 3 days. March 9, 1953, 9:50 p.m., the funeral laid the body to rest in Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square. Hundreds of thousands attended, and at least 100 people were crushed to death due to the crowds. March 1953. Russians who celebrated Stalin's death were arrested by police for anti-Soviet agitation. After World War II, Stalin's health began to decline. During his 3 decades in power, the Soviet premier commanded not just the party leadership, but also the hearts and minds of the Russian public. His personality cult was such that in spite of his reign of terror that caused tens of millions to die, he remained Uncle Joe, the father of all Russians to his final days. He died on March 5, 1953, aged 74. There was much rejoicing in hell as the demons prepared a special reception committee just for him. On October 31st, 1961, his body was moved to the Kremlin Wall necropolis in Moscow. Stalin stated, "I know that after my death a pile of rubbish will be heaped on my grave, but the wind of history will sooner or later sweep it away without mercy." Beria and 5 or 6 other defendants were tried, sentenced, and executed on December 23, 1953. The other defendants were shot immediately after the trial ended. Beria was executed separately. He allegedly pleaded on his knees before collapsing to the floor wailing. He was shot through the forehead by General Pavel Batitsky. He was 54 years old. His final moments bore great similarity to those of his own predecessor, NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, who begged for his life before his execution in 1940. Beria's body was cremated and the remains buried in communal grave number 3 in Donskoy Monastery Cemetery in Moscow. The execution of Beria proved to be the last time the loser of a top-level Soviet power struggle paid with his life. Succeeded Stalin, but after a week was forced from power by the other members of the Secretariat. The new leadership wanted to prevent too much power from being concentrated in one pair of hands. Khrushchev replaced him as party leader. Although he remained a staunch Stalinist, Malenkov opposed research and development of nuclear armament and started an international peace campaign against the use of nuclear weapons in 1953. He declared that a new world war with modern weapons means the end of world civilization. In debates on diplomacy, he always took the peaceful line. He attempted a coup against Khrushchev in June 1957, but Zhukov and the army maintained the status quo. He was exiled to Kazakhstan and became a manager of a hydroelectric plant. Later he fell into obscurity and suffered from depression from loss of power and the low quality of life in a poor province. Malenkov found this demotion and dismissal a relief from the pressures of the Kremlin power struggles throughout the 1950s. Malenkov in his later years converted to Russian Orthodoxy, as did his daughter, who has since spent part of her personal wealth building 2 churches in rural locations. Malenkov became a reader, the lowest level of Russian Orthodox clergy, and a choir singer in his final years. Eventually, he quit politics and kept a low profile for the rest of his life. He died on January 14, 1988, at age 86, and is buried in Kutsevo Cemetery in Moscow. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. The Central Committee formally elected him first secretary in September 1953, which meant he succeeded Stalin. Khrushchev advanced many reforms of the Soviet system and competed with the United States in every way. He is most infamous for slamming his shoe on a table at the UN in protest. He also went head-to-head against President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but blinked at the last minute. Leonid Brezhnev persuaded members of the Central Committee to support the ousting of Khrushchev while he was on travel. He taped his memoirs, which were smuggled out to the West and published. He died of a heart attack in Moscow on September 11, 1971, aged 77. He was denied full honors in a state funeral and was buried in the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. Nikolai Alexandrovich Bulganin. He was an ally of Khrushchev during his power struggle with Malenkov, and in February 1955 he succeeded Malenkov as Premier of the Soviet Union. In June 1957, when the dissenters tried to remove Khrushchev from power at a meeting of the Politburo, Bulganin vacillated between the 2 camps. In March 1958, at a session of the Supreme Soviet, Khrushchev forced his resignation, and in September, Buchanan was removed from the Central Committee and deprived of his title of Marshal. He was dispatched to Stavropol as chairman of the Regional Economic Council, a token position, and in February 1960 he retired on a pension. He died on February 24, 1975, aged 89. He is buried in Moscow at Novo da Vinci Cemetery, Plot 4. If you liked what you see, hit the subscribe button or share. Thank you. This has been EmersusTech.